This is Winchester Academy.
Thank you, Maggie, for making this all happen, and thank you all so much for coming in this beautiful spring weather. It's so nice. Can everybody hear me? Everybody in the back can hear okay? All right, good. We were going to have some slides, but my computer has decided in its underachieving way not to cooperate. But that's okay. My day job is literally describing things to people without pictures, so we'll do okay. And actually, Maggie, since you mentioned people nudging each other about interesting facts in the book, I actually had someone, while they were sitting next to me reading my book, and nudged me and said, "Did you know?" Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. This is my first trip to Winchester, but I can tell you it's not going to be my last. This is a lovely town, and the fact that you have such a lovely library is evidence enough for that, but there's so much more to it. I think there was something in the air when this all got set up, because when I was doing my prep work, I sometimes have to reread my own book to try and remember what it was I did and said and saw. I will sometimes, when I'm doing that kind of prep work, I'll put on, they have an online stream now where you can go back and listen to Casey Kasem's American Top 40 online, which my kids find fascinating. They'll run up to me and go, "Did you know that that Fleetwood Mac is up 3 notches this week?" Yes, and as of 1983, they are. But I just put that on, and if you've ever listened to the show, one of the things that he would always do, along with the long-distance dedication and these special reports about the different acts that are in, is that he would introduce some of the stations that would air the show. And so the one I was listening to yesterday, he said, "I'd like to welcome some new stations to the American Top 40 family, including WGLX in Wapaka, Wisconsin." I thought, well, this is very cosmic, isn't it? You know, that I'm headed there tomorrow, Casey. I think we're going to do okay. It's good to have good vibes, especially given what I'm here to talk about. It's a somewhat morbid subject. And I just want to state for the record, I am not a morbid person, despite the evidence that I did travel all over the country to see all of the grave sites of the US presidents. This is not who I am. This is just a hobby I had. I will say, though, Bill Clinton did once say that being president is a lot like running a cemetery. There's a lot of people underneath you and none of them listen. So, the only reason that I started going to see the grave sites is because I can't go back in time to see the presidents and meet them and get to know them. This is the next best thing. So I thought what I'll do is I'll just go and take a look at what was at that point a set of 39 grave sites. Technically there were 38 dead presidents, but if you want to do this kind of thing right, to go to all the presidents' graves, you have to go visit Grover Cleveland on 2 non-consecutive occasions, since he was president that way. So, of course, the number is now one higher, sadly, and so please don't, when you leave here, tell people that as of a few months ago, I have not been to all the grave sites of the US presidents. I will get down to Texas and see President Bush, I promise. So just mum's the word, right? What I did learn as I was traveling to all these different sites and monuments and memorials and museums was that even after the presidents pass on, they still have to keep working. They have their presidency, and then they're retired if they're lucky, they have their post-presidency, and then they have this period which I have called the post-presidency. And it's a very, very busy time for the presidents because of what we do in their honor and in their names. Now, some of this is very obvious. Every February we have a holiday called President's Day. We name streets after them. We put them on our money. The capital city is named Washington. That's the obvious stuff. But there's a lot of less obvious elements that include the US presidents too. I traveled on the highway to come to Wapaka tonight, and the official name of our interstate highway system is the Dwight D. Eisenhower System of Interstate and Defense Highways. The man who wrote the folk song, "This Land Is Your Land," his full name is Woodrow Wilson Guthrie. My favorite blues singer, the Howlin' Wolf, his full name is Chester Arthur Burnett. Baseball fans may remember the great pitcher Grover Cleveland Alexander. Interestingly, one of the people who's most often noted as having the name of a president, George Washington Carver, is not named for George Washington. That's a story for a whole different program. But, and then you get into commerce, where presidents can be used to sell all kinds of things, not just the money connection, but you hand over money to buy things that have presidents on them. I remember when I was traveling around and doing research that the Pez company was in the midst of sending out Pez dispensers of all, they would send them out, I think, in sets of 5. So if you ever wanted to pop a candy out of Zachary Taylor's neck, here's your chance finally. The dream is realized. The teddy bear is named for Teddy Roosevelt, that's a famous one. When I was in Cleveland, I saw this, and I felt like I needed to sit down after I saw this. This is a real thing that people sold with a president's name on it. And I quote, Garfield tea, laxative and diuretic, with the slogan, flush your bowels with Garfield tea. Poor guy. Dead presidents can set trends. When John F. Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, there was such a huge rise in people who also wanted to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery that the powers that be had to change the rules of who was eligible to be buried there because they were worried they were going to run out of space. Their bodies can sometimes be used to prove a point. 2 years before the Civil War, a president's body was exhumed from a northern state and returned to a southern state. Another president's body was paraded around the country just after the Civil War ended, essentially to convince northerners to treat the southern states harshly as they rejoined the Union. I'm pretty sure you can guess which one. And a third president was exhumed more than a century after his death, basically because of a conspiracy theory. Dead presidents show up in space. There are like 6 asteroids named after them. Dead presidents show up in sports. One of the places I went to was West Branch, Iowa, which is not only home to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, but it is also home to the National Hoover Ball Championships. He has his own sport. Dead presidents show up in food. The Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site in Vermont has a cheese-making shop that the Coolidge family started. It's actually really good. And in East Aurora, New York, there is a place that makes a sandwich called the Millard Fillmore. Chicken or something. This is my favorite. Dead presidents show up in the Star Wars universe. Or maybe, technically, the Star Wars universe shows up in the Dead Presidents universe. Woodrow Wilson is entombed in Washington National Cathedral, the northwest side of D.C., and they have among many other gargoyles and grotesques that they have on the outside of the building, they have a grotesque of Darth Vader's head. You have to look way up on the tower to see it, but you can, in one day trip, you can go see the president who fought the war to end all wars and the Sith Lord at the heart of the Star Wars. That's all right there. I mean, this is all fun and interesting, right? But why spend all this time learning about this world of the post-post presidency? What does it really matter? Well, if nothing else, it's worth knowing because we're all paying for it. Every president is entitled to a state funeral conducted by the US military. Each of them gets a presidential library run by the National Archives and Records Administration, and on their birthdays, the military will hold a wreath ceremony at each president's gravesite, all of which is funded publicly. We all pay for that. So it's worth knowing what you're paying for. And the world of the post-post presidency starts in the same place as the actual presidency, with George Washington. Just as he set all the conventions about how presidents conduct themselves in office and in life, and as a post-president, he did that in death too. There's one difference between George Washington and the whole rest of his successors. Usually we wait until the president has passed on to turn them into a legend, but with George Washington, we didn't want to wait. Not long after the revolution was over, the country wanted to build a giant statue of George Washington on horseback in the center of the new capital city. They wanted to have a giant statue as an example for the nation to follow. Now, George Washington remembered very clearly in the aftermath of the announcement of the Declaration of Independence. He was in New York City at the time, And he saw that when his troops heard the declaration read out loud for the very first time, their reaction was to find a statue of the British king on horseback and knock it to the ground and just smash to pieces. He did not want that to happen to him someday if this whole experiment in democratic self-rule should come to an unhappy end. So anytime anybody's like, let's build a statue here, he's like, let's just build a country, okay? Let's not build statues of me. There was only one exception, and that was when they decided to name the new capital city Washington. And the reason he let that happen was because he had chosen 3 commissioners to lead the entire development of this new capital city. And he didn't want to be a micromanager just because of his presidency. He said, you're making the decisions, not me, so whatever you do is up to you. Though, in his letters, he always referred to Washington, D.C. by its old name, the Federal City. So the country has been working all of this time to try and build George Washington as this huge figure, this historic man living in their time. And George Washington was saying, we have more important things to do, just settle down. And all that changed on December 14th, 1799. That's the day George Washington died, technically due to a throat infection called epiglottitis, but also an assist goes to his doctors, who took something like 5 of his 8 pints of blood while simultaneously trying to get him to throw up, which did not happen, but had he seen what was going to come after he died, he might as well have. See, George Washington was very clear in his will about what he wanted after death. One interesting note about George Washington's will, it says, don't bury me for 3 days after I'm dead, because he had a fear of being buried alive. But here's what else he didn't want. He didn't want long parades, he didn't want big speeches, he didn't want huge public uproar or outcry. He just kind of wanted a simple private funeral and then to be left alone. He had spent 22 years in public service between the military, helping found the Constitution, serving in office in his state, and then also as president. He just kind of wanted to go home and just do that, right? This is the exact quote from his will. It is my express desire that my corpse may be interred in a private manner without parade or funeral oration. Is that how he rolled? No, that's not what he got. He got the funeral parades that he said he didn't want. He got riderless horses, that military tradition going back to Genghis Khan. He got eulogy. There were 4 eulogies. He wanted none, and he got 4, one each longer than the last. And then when the rest of the country, of course, word traveled more slowly back then. When the rest of the country found out that George Washington had not only died, but they had already had the funeral services for him, they said, well, that's okay, we'll have mock funerals for him in all of the big cities of the United States. It said that there was so much mourning going on that for a time there were shortages of black cloth in the United States. And does that sound a little bit over the top? Maybe. But I can kind of understand where people were coming from. Remember, in the early days of the United States, this is a brand new system. These states have been used to keeping each other kind of at arm's length. They didn't know whether they could trust each other. The only reason that they were trusting each other was because they trusted George Washington. And he said, if you trust me, trust each other. Let's all work together. And they were worried, without George Washington there, we're going to start to lose our national unity. The country's going to start to splinter apart. And then who knows what's going to happen after that. So they kind of, without meaning to, came up with this idea that if George Washington is a mortal man, we could lose him and then we'll just have to see what the future is like. But if we honor him enough, then we don't ever lose him. He becomes something larger than a mortal man, and then we hang on to him and everything will be okay. Has anybody here been to the US Capitol building and done the tour? Have you been to the Rotunda? The big dome? If you look on the inside of the Capitol dome, there's a famous painting called The Apotheosis of Washington. Apotheosis meaning transformation or change. The painting in the US Capitol shows angels welcoming George Washington into heaven as a kind of demigod. That's what you can see when you look up into that dome. So this is just one of the examples of how Americans were determined to honor the heck out of George Washington. That's a very stirring one that spread all across the country. Some of the other efforts to honor George Washington were not nearly as successful or well received. Congress hired a sculptor named Horatio Greenough to make a massive work in Washington's honor. They wanted something at the Capitol. And in this statue, he decided, well, he'd studied under the old masters, he knew the works from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and he wanted to show that George Washington was every bit an exemplar of citizen government as the people in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. That here's someone who, like ancient Cincinnatus, the Roman dictator who held power just for a couple of weeks and then put his power down and went back to his fields. George Washington was the Cincinnatus of America. In fact, Cincinnati, Ohio is named for George Washington. He's someone who took power for a short time and voluntarily gave it back. So he tried to create a statue of George Washington taking the sword of government and handing it back to the people. What he actually made was a statue of George Washington in a toga, who may or may not be stabbing himself. The statue was installed in the Capitol, but it was almost literally laughed out of the building, at which point they decided this is probably something we want to move outside. And that didn't stop the ridicule. People who would walk by the George Washington in a toga statue would say, well, it looks like he just left Bath, so now he's trying to find his clothes. Eventually it ended up in the collection of the Smithsonian, and you can see it today at the National Museum of American History. I just saw a couple of weeks ago, and I had never seen this picture before, there's a picture of Muhammad Ali in his heyday stopping by the statue of George Washington, hanging out with the first president. It's, you know, the greatest president and the greatest of boxing. Yeah, kind of a nice combination. Nobody learned from anything from this. At the same time that the statue was being made, a group of lawmakers got it in their heads that a statue of George Washington is great, but wouldn't it be even better to have the actual George Washington? They said, let's bring his remains here to Washington, D.C., and they built a room inside the Capitol. If you've taken the tour of the U.S. Capitol, the room that you start in is called the Crypt. And it's not because they want to freak you out, it's because it was built to hold George and Martha Washington's caskets originally. The only problem was, they built this room with a lot of high hopes and nobody bothered to check with the Washington family. So when they showed up in Mount Vernon and said, we're here for the body, and they're like, what body? Well, we're here to bring George Washington to the crypt. Well, no, they're not going to do that. They said in his will, he said he wants to be here at Mount Vernon in the family tomb. He's not going anywhere. So much for that idea. Now the biggest success or challenge or both in this whole early effort to honor George Washington comes from a group of prominent citizens who said what we really need is a monument in Washington, D.C. And not just any monument, we need the biggest possible monument. At the time that it was first designed, the Washington Monument was intended to be the largest structure in the world, tallest. The Washington Monument builders, though, to make that giant monument needed a lot of marble. Marble costs a lot of money. They kept running out of marble and money. So every so often they would start building and then they'd run out of supplies and they'd run out of funds and they'd have to stop so that they could raise more money to bring in more supplies. Sometimes they would raise enough money to buy the supplies and they'd bring the supplies in, but then the cart carrying the marble to the building site would get stuck in the mud because DC is a swamp. And so then they would have to stop again and get it unstuck. So long story short, the Washington Monument was unfinished for decades and decades. It sat in the middle of the city as this big, unfinished stump. It got a reputation as being not so much of a monument, but a pretty good grazing ground for cows and sheep and pigs. Remember, George Washington died in 1799. In July of 1850, they were holding a big fundraiser to try and get this construction project back on track. It was actually on the 4th of July. And the guest of honor at this fundraiser for the Washington Monument was then President Zachary Taylor. It was a very hot day, and so President Taylor decided to cool off by eating cherries and drinking iced milk. Health officials in Washington had warned people not to consume either of those things because there had been an outbreak of disease. Let's just say, in honoring one dead president, we ended up creating another dead president. If you've been to the monument in DC, you'll notice that the color changes like 60% of the way up or something like that. That's because there's the stump that they were building on for all those decades, and then the part where it changes color up is where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stepped in and said, forget it, you guys don't know what you're doing. We're just going to finish this. And they did. Finally, in 1885, more than a century after the idea was first proposed, and 86 years after George Washington died. So that's the story of George Washington, the national myth. But there's also a story about his body. As I mentioned, he wanted to stay at Mount Vernon, but he said in his will that the old Washington family tomb needs to be replaced because it was right on the Potomac River, it was prone to flooding, and he didn't want something to happen to his bones. That only took 30 years. The enormous plantation, Mount Vernon was either the largest or one of the largest plantations of its time. It was enormously unprofitable, so they too did not have enough money to finish building this tomb. Also, the Washington family had to deal with people who had decided this is still private land, but they invited themselves over because everybody wants to pay tribute to George Washington, right? They were like national pilgrimages that people were making to the tomb. By the time they had finally built this new structure to hold Washington's sarcophagus, the sarcophagus and the coffin were deteriorating, so he had to be transferred to a new one. They opened his coffin, someone apparently clipped a lock or two of his hair, someone reportedly patted him on the head. We're just checking on him, they said. And then the new sarcophagus was put in place in the new tomb, but the door was not wide enough to hold the sarcophagus, so they had to build a whole new front piece to hold it, and while that was happening, somewhere along the line, someone clipped off a little piece of the eagle insignia that was on the top of the sarcophagus as a souvenir. But just like with the Washington Monument, the team at Mount Vernon, over time, ironed out the wrinkles of the tomb and the site. Things run in pretty ship shape today. You can take part in a number of activities. You can do the house tour, which is really cool. You can see the bed where Washington died in. You can see where he would entertain his guests. And he had plenty of those, some invited and some not. You can see the distillery. They have started producing liquor with George Washington's old recipes. If you're a fan of those Nicolas Cage movies, they have a national treasure tour at George Washington's Mount Vernon. For me, my favorite part, no surprise, is to go to the tomb because twice a day they have a wreath ceremony. I'm convinced that after they have the formal ceremony and they open up the gates so that you can take unobstructed pictures of the sarcophagus of General Washington and Mrs. Washington, if you lean in real close and listen carefully, you will hear George Washington rolling over in his grave and everything that's happened since 1799. Now, I said at the beginning that George Washington, just as he had done in life, had set precedents with his death. So what are the precedents that we see with presidents in their post-post presidencies? Well, we go big when it comes to funerals, whether the president wants it that way or not. Our monuments tend to be large and expensive, and there's plenty of controversy, a lot of public argument. We open a lot of coffins. There's thievery and bad behavior and scandal, but we generally get it right in the end. I will say, if you look at the timeline, George Washington died in 1799, and we don't have another dead president until July 4th, 1826, when both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the second and third presidents, both passed away on the same day. And I'm convinced that's because they saw what happened to Washington, and they were afraid of what was going to happen to them, so they just put it off as long as they could, so that the country didn't try and build too many monuments for them. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for coming, and thank you for listening, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have about Washington or any of the presidents since Washington. But thank you so much. And you can tell this is a well-run organization because they have the mics ready for questions.
I got the active one. Okay. And are there any questions? We'll be happy to bring the microphone to you.
Could you you mention or say something about maybe the 2 or 3 humblest tombs of various presidents?
The 2 or 3 humblest tombs, I can, and the funny thing about it is that the size of the tombs does not always correspond to the size of the president in history or personality or public recognition. The best example of that is Lyndon Johnson's tomb, which is in the Texas Hill Country, right next to the Pedernales River, about an hour west of Austin. Lyndon Johnson was as large a figure as you could possibly get. He was 6'4", so he was physically imposing, and there's a funny picture where he is standing over a lawmaker who he's trying to get to vote his way. And people called it the Johnson treatment at the time, because he would just stand over you and kind of make sure you did what he wanted. The interesting thing about Johnson's grave is that it is no bigger and no smaller than any of the others in the family burial plot out by the LBJ Ranch. Johnson, I think, decided that he wanted his big public display to be in his presidential library, which is 10 stories high. And the director of the LBJ library told me, I believe the direct quote is, "It looks like power," which is kind of what he wanted. It is an impressive, imposing structure, but his grave is quite just simple and not too adorned. I mean, it's got a presidential seal on there, I'm pretty sure, but you'd have to sort of, and I did have to look around a little bit to make sure I was looking at the right thing. Some of the others that have sort of quieter grave sites, you might expect Calvin Coolidge in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. He was a pretty quiet guy. There's a joke. The famous writer Dorothy Parker, someone told her that Calvin Coolidge, the quietest president, had died, and she said, "How can you tell?" But he is also buried in a family cemetery just off to the side of the State Historic Site, and it's pretty much the same kind of thing, just a straightforward granite tomb. Conversely, some of the presidents who are very poorly remembered today, some who were assassinated and didn't serve very long, some who didn't have terribly memorable presidencies by comparison to some of their other successors, have huge tombs. That's because the Victorian era presidents died at a time when big, very ornate, colorful tombs were the style of the time. Death was not just a fact of life in their time, it was an aesthetic too. And so you'd see something like the McKinley Monument in Canton, Ohio, which is up on top of a giant hill, and it basically looks like a planetarium on a hill, because he wanted people to remember this guy. James A. Garfield, who was assassinated in 1881, he's in Cleveland, Ohio. And he's in a death castle. He's in the basement of this giant castle, which has just about every kind of feature you could possibly think of, including, and I wish I were making this up, there is a mural of the assassination of James A. Garfield on the walls of the death castle. It's really something. You see him walking through the train station in Washington, D.C., and you see the ticket taker saying, "Look out, sir, look out!" And then you see the assassin striking forward. I don't know that I would want something like that in my tomb. I guess they didn't consult him because it was an unexpected development. But so yeah, that's one of the interesting things is that the tombs are always surprising. They don't always line up with what you'd expect. Great question.
Are there any presidents that you know of? I know of one. I teach U.S. history, but could you tell me this? Are there some presidents that did not want to be recognized as presidents, like Thomas Jefferson, I think on his gravestone? Are there any other ones that did not want to really be known as president of the United States?
Yes, Thomas Jefferson is the most famous one because he put a lot of thought. He designed his own obelisk to go over his tomb, which was, the original one was picked to pieces by souvenir hunters who had invited themselves to Monticello. And so the last little bits of that, they moved to the University of Missouri, and then they put up a new one. Jefferson had wanted 3 specific things to be on his obelisk, and one was that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, The others were he was the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedoms and also the founder of the University of Virginia. There's a whole big story behind why he chose those things over being president. The story that I find most interesting is Chester A. Arthur, who was the president after Garfield. He took over. His first act as president, once he'd learned that Garfield had died, was to lock himself in his room at home in New York City and cry, which is an understandable reaction given how everything had gone, but he did not feel himself worthy of the position. He had been kind of a political hack for a long time, kind of an enforcer for a political machine in New York. And all of a sudden he was president of the United States. And he acquitted himself fairly well, but when he started his decline in health, he instructed some of his relatives to burn all of his personal papers. We don't know exactly why that was, but the long and the short of it is that Chester A. Arthur is not a very well-remembered president. I will say, though, that remember I mentioned about the Victorian-era tombs? He has one of the coolest ones in Albany, New York. He has a casket above ground inside a sarcophagus, and there is a statue of a weeping angel standing over his sarcophagus, which is something you sure don't see much of anymore. It is a fascinating spot in a rural cemetery in eastern New York. But he did not particularly want to be remembered for being president. And I'm sure there were a few people who felt the same way about him. And they got their wish.
Okay, great. I got one. I got a couple of them for you. First off, there was another president, I believe it was James Monroe, that died on Independence Day. The other one is a second president that was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, along with Kennedy. What do you know about those graves?
I can tell you a fair bit about those. Monroe was the third president in a row to pass away on the 4th of July. As I mentioned how John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the same day, 4th of July, 1826, which happened to be the 50th anniversary of the approval of the Declaration of Independence, which was kind of a big deal for both of them. And then a few years later, Monroe, the fifth president, had also died on the 4th of July in New York. And there was one other president in there, James Madison of Virginia, who was starting to decline in health. He was in his mid-80s and not doing terribly well. And it was mid-June, and the doctor said, "Sir, we can fix this for you. If you would like to die on the 4th of July like your friends, we can keep you alive until then." He said, "No, no thank you, absolutely not." Monroe is interesting because he died in New York. He was from Virginia, but he died in New York because in retirement, you didn't get a pension back then. You held a public office, and then you left office, and you were a private citizen again, so you had to go get a job. And like many of the plantation presidents, he was cash poor, ended up having to sell his land and move in with his daughter's family in New York. That's where he died. He was buried in a cemetery in Manhattan, and then in the run-up to the Civil War, there was a governor of Virginia who said, Virginia presidents should be buried in Virginia. And so he managed they were talking about just holding an anniversary. It was like the anniversary of 100 years of James Monroe or something like that. And they were just talking about having some kind of, New York and Virginia working together to have, commemorations. And then it ended up that they were going to exhume his remains and bring them back by steamship to Virginia. This governor had it in his mind that they were going to get all the presidents from Virginia, except for Washington, to be buried in one spot in Richmond, just to show the rest of the country who was the best state. And so they managed to bring Monroe to this spot called President's Circle in Hollywood Cemetery, Richmond. And they put out feelers to Madison's people and Jefferson's people. And we don't know whether Madison's people ever responded, but Jefferson's people said, "No, thank you." They did get another president up on President later, but I'll hold off on that story. And the other president you mentioned that's in Arlington National Cemetery was William Howard Taft, who, if you go to Arlington, it's not hard to find John F. Kennedy. It is easy to get lost on your way to Taft, because he's not exactly like on the lead path. Taft of course, was both President and Chief Justice of the United States. And he was more proud of the latter than the former. But one interesting thing is because he stayed in high office after being president, he stayed in Washington, D.C. And so the Tafts lived in a very large house in D.C., sort of the Georgetown area, for the years after he was president and for the years he was Chief Justice. When I was there, and this was 5 years ago or so, that was when the Syrian civil war had just gotten started. And if you remember when that all got going, the U.S. was starting in very slow, sort of diplomatic ways to try to support the rebels without getting directly involved, but also try to put a little bit of pressure here and there on the Syrian government. So at a certain point when there had been some kind of attacker, I don't remember what prompted it, but the U.S. said the Syrian diplomats need to leave the country. You have to leave the Syrian embassy. Well, that was William Howard Taft's house. So he kicked them out of Taft's old house. And when I was there, the Syrian diplomats had long gone, but the flags were still on the outside of the building, and there were people still cutting the grass. So it's kind of weird how these presidents can come back. You know, Taft is over 100 years removed from our time, and yet his house, at least, is still playing a role in our time.
Any idea why one of the most popular questions became, who's buried in Grant's tomb?
I know a little bit about it. It's an old joke that precedes what I'm going to tell you about, but it became famous nationally because of Groucho Marx. If you remember the old radio and then TV show, You Bet Your Life, Groucho would ask serious questions to the contestants when they were playing the game, and then if they lost all their money and didn't win the prize, Groucho was a softy and decided that he didn't want any contestant to go away completely empty-handed. So if you lost, he would say, okay, I got one more question for you. So for $5, who's buried in Grant's tomb? And of course they would answer it, and he'd go, all right, you got a question, you won a prize. The funny thing about Groucho is that his writers at least, would throw in a few other questions like, what color is an orange? And if they answer the question, he'd still go, General Grant is absolutely right. And of course, the funny thing about it is that no one is actually buried in Grant's tomb. They are entombed there, but they're above ground. So it's not really quite a tomb. I don't want to be that guy, but, well, actually, no one's buried in Grant's tomb.
Brady, could you tell us a little bit about your process of visiting all these different grave sites? How long did that take you? How did you locate them? Are they all in public places?
That was a great question. To start with the last question first, no, they are not all in public places. There are a few that are still technically on private ground, so you can't really go anytime you want. They are at least all publicly accessible some of the time these days, which was not always the case. If someone had tried to do this project in, say, the 1870s, they would have been required to break a few laws to do a little trespassing to make it happen. All of them are, with the exception of two, west of Lake Kansas, or I'm sorry, east of Lake Kansas. And I was living in New Hampshire at the time that I did this. That made it pretty convenient for me to fly in and out to get to all of the different sites. But still, it took me like 3 years of actual traveling on and off. I was working a day job then, as I do now, and so I would fit in 3 or 4 day weekends when I could. I would turn family vacations, I'm sorry to my family. I would turn my family vacations into little road trips to see cemeteries and monuments. I kind of, this is before my two youngest came along, but my oldest of the three has worked forever. Poor little guy, he was 2 years old and he would ask me everything. There's a family story that we tell all the time now. He was about 1.5 years when the 2012 presidential election came along. And this is when I had started traveling to all of the grave sites. And so I'd say, I'm going to the airport, and he'd say, who are you going to go see? I'd say, I'm going to go see James Madison. He was president long ago. Or I'm going to go see George Washington. He was president long ago. So anytime he mentioned a president, he'd go, he was president long ago. So then, It's 2012. We're living in, like Wisconsin, New Hampshire was a swing state and continues to be one. And so the President of the United States, who was running for re-election, decided to hold a campaign appearance with former President Clinton. So you have two presidents who come to your town. So I was actually working that day, but my wife said, well, I wanted to see presidents. So they walked over, and there's all these people sort of taking in this idea that Bill Clinton's speaking and then Barack Obama's speaking, and there's my 1.5-year-old going, that's President Obama. He was president long ago. The other nice thing about traveling to the different grave sites is that they are kind of clustered together. They're not really evenly distributed throughout the United States. There are quite a few Virginia presidents and quite a few in Ohio. So you can wind up seeing 3 or 4 at a time. There are 2 spots in the United States where you can see 2 presidents kind of at the same time. There's a church in Quincy, Massachusetts, which has both John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And that Hollywood Cemetery, which has James Monroe, just across the way is the 10th president, John Tyler. They were basically on the same hill. So that made it easier travel-wise. What I found, I don't want to say it was the hardest part, but tracking down some of the stories behind the tombs. Not all of these sites have very large websites, because some of them are just kind of off to themselves. They're not really part of, there's not a museum for Martin Van Buren in Kinderhook, New York. It's just in a cemetery. So tracking down why things are the way they are in these different sites meant finding books that were maybe not in print or not widely distributed anymore, tracking down people who are part of volunteer cemetery associations or Friends of Van Buren kinds of groups, people who would have something to say about the way a president was remembered or not, and finding some of the ways that a president might be remembered that maybe you wouldn't expect. The reason I keep saying Van Buren is because I keep thinking of his house in upstate New York. When I was visiting there, there was a downed tree, and there was this big sign in front of it saying, this tree is going to be sent to the Rhode Island School of Design for a liberal arts, like a history and art double class. The students are going to learn about this era in history, and then they're going to create something out of the wood that represents some of the themes that they learned about. And I thought, well, that's kind of an unusual post-presidency. You become the work of art in a way. So I hope that kind of answers your question, or I'm just rambling. Either.
Nice.
We've got some questions up front here.
She's got the mic. Here she comes.
I'm just curious about the correlation between presidential libraries in your travels to finding tombs. Are presidential libraries kind of a newer thing? And are there presidents actually buried in their libraries?
The answer to both questions is yes. Our presidential libraries are kind of a new thing, at least in the way that we do them now. The way that it has always worked, at least until the modern era, was that presidents, by virtue of being private citizens who hold public office and then go back to being private citizens, was that they would get to take their papers with them when they were done. So George Washington, when he left office, he went back to Mount Vernon and he had folders and folders of his papers that he just sort of stuck in places in his house, and then mice ate some of them. And others they managed to keep safe and preserved, but they weren't organized in any particular way. There were a few presidents, John Quincy Adams being one of them, who realized that these are probably important papers, and of course his dad had been president before him, so he had built on the grounds of the Adams family compound in Massachusetts a large fireproof library to house all of their stuff, and that wound up comprising not only both Presidents Adams, but also Charles Francis Adams and Henry Adams, all of these Adamses over the years who had contributed something to public life. All of their stuff was in this library. And there have been a few other examples of that. James Garfield's widow in Mentor, Ohio, had built a fireplace safe that she kept all of her husband's things, mostly papers, but also some of the memorabilia from his funeral. They're in that safe. You can see there were some flowers that Queen Victoria had sent, for example, so they have some of those kinds of things. But the first example of a president or a president's family putting the papers and the materials out for the public to see was about 110 years ago. It was the Rutherford B. Hayes family. You all know them, right? In Northwest Ohio, Fremont, the Hayes family said, well, you know, we're kind of proud of what our ancestor did, and so we want to put all of that out into the world. So they created a second building next to his giant house, Spiegel Grove, which is a beautiful house. They created a second structure there, and it was a public presidential library. It was public in the sense that it was open to the public, but public presidential libraries today are more modeled off of something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put together. He had known about the Hayes Library, and he said, well, I have a lot of papers. I've been president for a while. I would like the country to have these, and I would like to also be remembered, so maybe I can have a presidential library. And his invention was that it would become a piece of the National Archives. He didn't want it to be in the National Archives because, one, then your papers are in with everybody else's papers, and two, he had so darn many papers. Basically, he was the first presidential hoarder. He just had stuff. Papers, maps, he collected stamps. He just had tons and tons of things. So he said, I know, we'll make it a public presidential library run by the National Archives, and we'll have it at my house in Hyde Park, New York. And he was president at the time he proposed this. He had served 2 terms, and people were already saying, well, this guy's drunk with power, and now he wants to build a library to himself while he's president. People thought it was bonkers, or at least some people said, you know, this is not ancient Egypt, we're not building pyramids here. But the Congress ended up going along with it, and the great argument that Roosevelt made to them, think if we had had access to all those private papers that past presidents had kept stored away in their houses. Think if we had had Lincoln's papers. Those weren't available until the 20th century. Think if we had had John Adams' papers. Those were not available until the 20th century. He was president in 1797. Think if we had had Jefferson's papers and Jackson's papers and all of these other papers. Think of what we could learn about the presidency and about the inner workings of government. Think of what historians can do to teach us all. And that was what finally won them over. So the first modern presidential library built as a publicly funded, taxpayer-managed institution was the Franklin Roosevelt Library in New York. I should say the library parts are funded by tax dollars. The museum parts are at least initially funded by private donations. So that's why you see when a president is wrapping up a term, they all of a sudden are going to all these fundraisers. They're not raising funds for their super PAC, or they're not raising funds for their, you know, Me for America organization. They're raising funds for the library because these buildings cost sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's because they want to showcase any items or any issues or any ideas that were important to them during their presidencies. And in recent years, and this is really sort of from Jimmy Carter on into the present, retired presidents or ex-presidents often use their presidential libraries as sort of a base of operations. You know, Jimmy Carter monitors elections all over the world. He's done that work to eradicate guinea worm disease and many other things. They will use their presidential library as sort of headquarters for whatever public issues or ideas they work on in quote-unquote retirement. So most presidents have chosen to be buried at the site of the presidential library, and often those are either at their homes where they grew up or where they lived as an adult, or both. Eisenhower's is where he was born, Hoover's is where he was born, Roosevelt's is where he was born, and where he lived throughout his life, because he always lived in the family home. For them, it's a chance for the public to sort of see their entire careers go full circle, from where they started, their humble beginnings, all the way through their rise to power, and then the legacy that they leave behind. They tend to be buried there, but Lyndon Johnson is not buried at his, John F. Kennedy is not buried at his, and Jimmy Carter has decided not to be buried at the Carter Library in Atlanta because he wants to be buried in Plains. And he is very clear that the reason he wants to be buried there is because he loves his home community so much he wants tourists to come there. And he knows that people will. So he is envisioning his own death as an economic driver for the Greater Plains community. It's another unexpected sort of post-presidency, right? Yes?
First of all, I just want to make a comment. You talked about the Roosevelts. When I was at that monument, what my husband and I were so impressed by is listening to his speeches. And that was amazing to me, that we could listen to his voice. That was super. Another thing I'd like to ask you is his dog buried with him. His little brave dog buried. Have you seen, when you've gone to cemeteries and monuments, have you seen strange different things that were buried with or near the presidents because that was their wishes?
Yes. So Franklin Roosevelt's dog, Fala, and one other dog are buried next to Franklin and Eleanor, which I think is great. And if you go to the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial in DC, there's a statue of the dog on that ground too, which is fantastic. I love Fala, one of my favorite presidential dogs. I could do a whole hour on presidential dogs, but I don't know that I draw that many people. Did I ever tell you about President Harding's dog, Laddie Boy? No. Okay, I'm sorry, I've just distracted myself. What was the second part of the question?
Other things that were buried.
Yes, the other story that came to my mind was President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination. He is buried in his hometown of Greeneville, Tennessee, which is far in eastern Tennessee. The closest way to get to Greeneville, Tennessee is to fly to Charlotte, North Carolina, and then drive 3 hours in kind of a half circle. So it's not close to a lot of things, but boy, is it worth the trip. It's absolutely beautiful. The thing about Andrew Johnson is that he was, in a lot of ways, like Lyndon Johnson, a very insecure person, thought that most of the hoity-toity people in Washington, D.C. were looking down on him, which was probably true. Didn't trust any of them. And then he became president, so he was kind of their boss, and then they tried to impeach him and remove him from office. So a lot of bad blood there. A very suspicious guy who ended up butting heads with everyone in his path. When he was in office, he was vetoing everything that the Congress was passing. They were trying to impose some harsh terms on the states that were re-entering the Union after the Civil War. He was all for punishing those people. He didn't trust Southerners either, even though he was one. But he didn't feel that the Constitution allowed that. And he also didn't like the Congress's idea of letting African Americans vote, and some of those other kinds of ideas. He was not exactly in favor of racial equality, shall we say. And so he fought and fought and fought and fought and fought, but always believed that he was right, and that he was maybe the only man in the country who truly understood the Constitution as it was written and should be understood. So Andrew Johnson was impeached but not removed from office by a single vote. He spent the last part of his presidency, and I am not making this up, feeding a family of mice that he met in the White House. They had just sort of infested, and he was like, oh, I'll give them some food. I don't have anything else to do. And then he came back home to Tennessee. He desperately wanted to be put back into public office. He knew he wasn't going to ever be elected president. He was far too unpopular for that, but he figured if he worked hard enough, he would eventually get back to Washington. And so he ran for Congress a couple of times. He lost. He ran for his old seat in the U.S. Senate. He lost. He ran for it again, and then he won. And so he was welcomed back into the same chamber where they had tried to throw him out when he was president. Some of the same people who had said, this man is so dangerous, he needs to be kicked out of the White House, were shaking hands, hey, how you doing? And so he finally felt vindicated. And then he had a stroke and died. So, so he had kind of, who wants to go, right? But if you gotta go, at least you gotta have good timing. And sort of he had good timing in that sense, that he was vindicated first and then he passed away. So in Andrew Johnson's will, this is my long-winded way of answering the question. There is a conclusion to this. Andrew Johnson said in his will, because he didn't want to twist the knife one last time, he said, "I would like to be buried with the only pillow that I feel is right, a copy of the Constitution of the United States under my head." So I just wanted to make sure that was in there. Great question, right?
One more question in the back.
How about William Henry Harrison?
Oh, William Henry Harrison. Or William Henry Harrison, right? Here's a guy who, talk about bad timing. Here's a guy who was about as accomplished an American as you could possibly have in his time. He was a war hero, he had been a territorial governor, he had served in Congress, he was elected president, massively popular man who ended up dying 30 days into his first term and is remembered not for any of the things he did in life, but for the thing that ended his life. And of course, when you die after 30 days, presidents aren't supposed to die after 30 days, so something stupid must have happened, like he stood out in the cold for hours and hours and gave an insanely long inaugural address. And so we remember William Henry Harrison as the guy who was too dumb to put on a coat when he was speaking outside in Washington, D.C. in March for hours and hours and hours. Not great. Harrison died so quickly that his family didn't hear about it until they were packing to go to Washington, D.C. They were still back in Ohio. And then they said, "Well, we're on our way." And I said, "No, just stay put. He's coming to you. Don't come to him." It happened so fast that they didn't really have anywhere to put him. So they had to temporarily put him in the burial ground that it's called Congressional Cemetery, because if you were in Congress and you died, which was not unusual, especially in those days, for the lawmakers who stuck around during malaria season, they had a crypt and they just stuck him in. He was in that crypt for 3 months and he was only president for 1. So Harrison did not have the greatest presidency. In fact, when they rank presidents, he doesn't even get to be in the rankings because he wasn't long enough to have done anything. Harrison was eventually taken back by train to southwest Ohio, to North Bend, which is a town sort of on the outskirts of Cincinnati. His tomb is beautiful. It's an obelisk that's overlooking the river, so you can actually stand there, and you can, if you look this way, you see his tomb, and if you look this way, you see Kentucky, which is kind of cool. You had asked before about our tombs publicly accessible. And you can go to that site and look around anytime it's daylight hours, but you can't necessarily go in. And like a fool, I didn't know that. I should have looked it up, but I showed up in town, and I had a stroke of luck that got me into the tomb. I stopped off at the Harrison Signs Museum, which is a local museum, just sort of comprising the history of the Harrison family, because of course his father had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and then his grandson was a president as well. So the Harrisons and the Symes, he married the Symes.
I didn't know that.
And so the museum is just about them. I had showed up there Saturday afternoon, thinking that it was Sunday afternoon, which is when the museum was open. And it was closed, but the guys who ran the museum were in there building stuff. They were working on improvements. So they were like, "Oh yeah, you can come in." And it also turned out that those guys had the key to the tomb. So when they got done showing me around the museum while it was closed and taking them away from their project, they also drove me over to the tomb and let me look inside, which was totally cool. It's a very, very pretty spot, and doesn't get as many visitors as it probably should, but it's so easy. It's such a great example of how easy it is to forget the entirety of a person's life and career because of one thing that happens. I think it was Claire Booth Luce who said that each president gets one sentence to be remembered by. And everything they do from the moment they're elected on is to try and write that sentence. And sometimes they get what they want, sometimes they don't. He did not get his sentence, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
up front too, so if anyone would like to purchase one of his books, feel free. And is there anybody here who did not learn something tonight? No.